Moving on, we have 30 minutes, 35 minutes available to us for discussion. As before, I have a mountain of questions. I have to say a great deal of these relate to how ORCID can fit in with the environment, as well as some very interesting questions for both Heather and Kelly. I'd like to start with a question for Kelly, but it does actually impact on all three of you, if I can use that expression. The question is from Steve Fleischer, and he's asking, what evaluations are required for guaranteeing a certain minimum level of academic quality in the publishing process, in the research output process? In other words, if somebody produces a manuscript or a draft of a paper, what kind of evaluation, and we're talking about presumably other than formal peer review, might be used? And I know obviously Greg will have a view on this as well from an SSRN perspective. So if I can address that to Kelly first, if she could talk about that would be great.
Right, so, well, just to clarify, is he asking what kinds of evaluations could be used or what kinds are actually being used?
Well, the question he asks, what evaluations are necessary? So I think that there's there's an implicit conditional question there, I think.
Okay, so what kind of evaluation might be necessary? So here's why I think rhetoric really comes into play, because particular journals, for example, do actually have particular kinds of audiences. And so when a journal is going to be interested in evaluating the quality of something that it's considering publishing, they're going to have particular concerns that are related to what kind of audience they're trying to reach. Now, I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that journals ought to be trying to reach audiences beyond academics, because I'm pretty sure a lot of them already do. So I'm not so much really concerned with the kinds of evaluation procedures that would impact upon journals. More so, I'm concerned with the kind of evaluation procedures that occur in universities to begin with, because I think these are the main kinds of criteria that determine what constitutes academic rigor, and therefore what ends up being submitted to journals for publication. So I'm talking about incorporating things like timeliness or explicit relevance to a particular social issue that they've identified that their research could help to sort of mitigate or ameliorate, or explicitly drawing connections and working to engage with particular individuals and groups and organizations for whom that research might be meaningful.
So this is almost an informal system of appraisal. So it's a community-based form of appraisal, if you like. What we might in other areas refer to as the sniff test. In other words, does this look and feel like something which approximates to an output of scholarly quality?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite it. I think maybe now it looks kind of like a sniff test because it's really different from what we're used to thinking of as constituting academic quality. But I don't think it's the case that changing what we think of as being quality work would necessarily mean downgrading the level of quality there, right? Because in some sense, quality is a sort of like sliding scale to begin with.
Of course, yeah. How does the SSRN network respond to less than ideal levels of scholarship? I seem to remember some pretty interesting slides appearing in Chicago.
Well, as you can imagine, we fully support the concept of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and when you have 1,000 flowers, you occasionally wind up with a few weeds. And that one handwritten submission, the photograph of a PDF, was kind of an interesting one. But I think that Kelly introduces a really interesting concept, right? And that's that you kind of filter at the beginning not at the end of this process. And I think that certainly is one of the tools. We've looked a lot and spent a lot of time talking to folks about the whole concept of open review. There's a great paper by Benkler called Kosa's Penguin, where he talks about this concept of open source and this concept of using a /dot type rating system. And can you goose that up a little bit so the Nobel Prize winner doesn't have to spend 3 years building up their ratings? So there's some interesting tools out there to try to figure out better ways to evaluate this surfeit of content that's flowing over our desks. I think Kelly's idea is a good one. I do have a bit of a concern that it may be limiting, and so there's certain areas where you have a level of expertise that would require some filtering on the front end. You talk to the folks at Archive, and they get the I became a physicist this afternoon concept, and so they write a paper and submit a paper this week and next week and next week and next week. So you kind of get this overwhelming things in some areas. We've had the issue in philosophy where everybody thinks of themselves as a philosopher, and that kind of offends the scholars that are really philosophers. So, I think it's a lot of tools, but the front-end filtering is an interesting concept, but I think that we need to make sure that we have a plethora of tools, arrows in the quiver, because what I want for, my concern about my child being sick this morning is going to be different than when I want to see what people in other disciplines are saying about the research idea I have in, econometrics. So I'm a little bit cautious that what I liken it to? I think we're always looking for the number. I think H-index becomes the number. So I don't have a problem with H-index, but I have a problem with the way in which people say that H-index is the number. And as human beings, we want to try to find the number, but I don't think there is a number. So I'm a bit cautious to say that any one tool is the right one. I think we need to spend the time to figure out what tool is the right one for the right point in time.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I could see you wanted to add to it. So yeah, coming directly to you.
I do want to add to it. So I want to raise Carl Bodinger, a really smart postdoc, was at the most recent PLOS article-of-metrics workshop, and he and others made the great point that we really need to that the power often comes when we personalize the impact metrics. In some ways, learning that some paper has made some percentile difference, or someone has a high H-index is interesting, but it doesn't get us at the same gut level as saying, "Hey, my boss, did you know that your boss blogged about my paper?" Right? As saying, "Hey, other people on the grant review committees, your peer, it was your peers." It doesn't need to be a lot of people if it's the right people, and the right people is different for different contexts. So being able to get there, being able to say what's the evidence that is really relevant for this situation, is a really powerful thing. I think it's a hard thing, but it's a powerful thing.
So, and I would want to add to that, that would be something that I wanted to bring up in relation to your presentation, Heather, because I think what's really interesting about sort of standardizing in some sense these kinds of counts of, say, retweets or bookmarks, to say this has been bookmarked to within this particular percentile, right? That could be really interesting for introducing the idea that there is a certain expectation for the level of impact that one's work has. But then I think the important consideration there is to turn that around and to say something to the effect of, we can't expect everyone's work to achieve a really high percentile rating, right? Because sometimes that work is only relevant to particular people, but that doesn't make the work any less meaningful. So like you were saying, you introduce this idea that there might be particular people or particular audience for whom one's work is really relevant, but then demonstrating that the audience is actually paying attention and that they're engaging with your work is really where you're going to get the most bang for your buck out of impact measures.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I agree.
Garlic, so you had an opinion?
No, I have a question. Actually, I find the idea to be quite interesting, but what I'm thinking is, wouldn't that make multidisciplinary work a little bit more visible, because it probably touches on a lot more people than very specific areas of work, and aren't we this way sort of sort of discriminating or creating a situation where specific areas, very specific areas are less visible or considered less meaningful. I don't want to say meaningful,
Right.
but
I know what you mean, yeah.
so the more wider audience you touch and the more multidisciplinary work is, in this type of model, that's what will happen.
Well, so that's why I would say to emphasize not just the quantity of it, right? Not just like the number of retweets or the percentile that you might fall in. But so this is why I would say to be really explicit about who it is that's using your research and to what end they're using your research, because that's going to sort of standardize, in a sense, the impact of your work. To say if your work is meant to be useful to particular kinds of people, and those people are actually using it, I think that means much more than just having a broad survey of like, well, these people seem to be paying attention to our work, but we have no idea why or for what end. You know, so it's not that. I would be wary of thinking that because there's always. Sorry, let me get my turn in line. So there's always a danger of highlighting something to the exclusion of something else when you just rely on having particular kinds of numbers to explain what's going on. So in that sense, I mean, something that I wanted to sort of get to as a tangent of my presentation is that numbers are not just descriptions of what's going on. They're not just descriptions of reality, but in a sense, they're also proscribing reality. And so there is a danger that you could be highlighting, for example, breadth at the expense of valuing also depth, because we do consider both of these valuable. So the emphasis on context is precisely to standardize it to value both.
And I think as is the context of flavors. So I think that the idea of a multidisciplinary research that many people are interested in and need to read for background information will reflect itself in certain types of interactions and engagement, as opposed to a different sort of research that is a methodological advance that's really profound but perhaps has a smaller audience. Now that's never going to get as many tweets, right? But for goodness sakes, it might get some really interesting citations, and we might be able to tell from citation context, right, doing some text mining around that citations, that paper was really important in subsequent discoveries. So I think seeing these different patterns in different sorts of metrics is where we start to see and give due credit to all the different sorts of research outputs that we make.
Yes.
I just what? Sure.
May I make a comment now? Is that possible? This is Henk Moed from Amsterdam.
Henk,
Can I
please
make
go
a
ahead.
Very much interested in this discussion of the multidimensionality of impact or quality, and I think we've heard some very good, very interesting contributions. But I would like to make, if I may, one general comment, and I would like to make especially two distinctions that I believe are very important. And first, the general comment, I fully agree with Heather that there are so many different dimensions or aspects of impact and quality. I really fully agree with that. But I think it's important that we realize that we should not mix all those dimensions, or to think that we are measuring one while we're interested in the other. Generally speaking, I think that the type of metrics that you use, that the decision about that very much depends upon, first of all, what it is that I'm assessing, why I'm assessing it, and which aspects do I want to assess. And depending upon the answer of those questions, you can choose your metrics. And it's very important that we do not mix them, and that we continue to distinguish the various types of metrics. Now, in order to illustrate that, if I may, I would like to make two important distinctions. The first is between, say, scholarly impact and societal impact. Heather mentioned that already. Scholarly impact primarily relates to the contributions that researchers make at the research front, whereas societal impact, of course, is much broader and perhaps primarily relates to the degree to which you actually solve societal problems, or it may relate to something like enlightenment whatsoever. Now, I think that many of the old metrics that were mentioned that primarily measure societal impact and not scholarly impact. And I think it's very important that we make clear to ourselves, but also to potential users, that this is actually the case, and that you may even have people who achieve a reasonably high societal impact, but no substantial scholarly impact at all. If I may give an example, we had in the Netherlands for a long time all kinds of debates among economists at television, the so-called tele-economists. And there was a general belief, and actually an empirical verification, that the correlation between, say, the societal impact or the visibility at the telly on the one hand and the scholarly impact correlated negatively. So the more visibility people had at television, the lower their performance was from a scholarly point of view. And I give this example, it is perhaps a little bit extreme, but I want to underline the differences between the two types of impact. And if we are primarily interested in measuring scholarly impact, then we should be very careful with actually using or promoting even the more, say, old metric type of indicators. This was my first distinction, if I may. I make a second one and then I really finish. The second is a little bit more difficult, but let me try to make the distinction within attempts to measure something like scholarly impact. So, within that domain, I think you can distinguish between, an approach that focuses on immediacy, on immediate value or immediate impact, and also approaches on the more reflected forms of impact. And I think it's important that we distinguish these two also very well. You can illustrate that, for instance, in the many empirical studies that are now being launched about, well, it's a very common issue, about the correlations between citations and downloads. And what you will see, what I often hear is, well, these two correlate so strongly, positively one to the other. I don't think that that's the case. If you look carefully at the data, then you will see that they don't correlate so well at all. And you have many papers that are actually being downloaded very frequently, but that receive very few citations. And I give this example in order to illustrate what I mean with distinguishing between immediacy value or immediacy impact on the one hand, and a more reflected or a more, say, delayed impact at the other. It does take some time for a finding to be really fully grasped and discussed and so on. So it may very well be that articles seem to be of high value at first sight, but then after certain reflection that normally takes place in writing a paper, are not conceived as so useful at all. So this is again a simple example to illustrate the relevance of these two aspects. And I think it's very important that we make it clear to all users, evaluators, that these distinctions, if I'm right of course, that they make sense and that they are crucial also if it comes to the question which metrics are the most relevant or which metrics are the most important ones. And again, if you're interested in measuring a more reflected form of impact or scholarly contribution at the research front, then you should not use the alt metrics or many of the alt metrics that have been proposed. And again, I don't want to say that the dimension that the alt metrics measure is irrelevant. On the contrary, especially in social sciences and humanities, more and more voices appear claiming that societal impact there is a very important aspect. And I really encourage all alternative methods to further develop. My point at this moment is merely, let's make clear to ourselves and to our users that there are a couple of important distinctions that we have to make. Thank you, and sorry for this long comment. Normally I don't talk that much, but in this particular case I have the opportunity.
Can I take that one? Can I take that one, please?
Please do, Kelly, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Moen, very much for your input. I really appreciate your analysis in drawing these distinctions, but I want to press you on whether or not these distinctions are really have to be the case, whether or not these are necessary distinctions. Because I think altmetrics is really making the argument that impact in the public sphere is scholarly impact. Which is why I'm making the point that occupying accountability or even like occupying impact, the idea of impact as scholars, means that we get involved in the public such that the example that you cited with The Economist isn't actually the case. So that the public impact had by scholars is scholarly impact, and we don't see a particularly noticeable downgrade in the quality of scholarship. What we do see is reforming the means through which the activities and practices through which what we do as research is considered scholarship, so that it incorporates societal relevance, so that it takes into account engagement with the public, and so that we can say that this is a good thing, that public impact is scholarly impact. And to your second distinction, to the difference between the immediate impact and the delayed impact, I would say perhaps the fact that downloads is not, so let me just throw this out there. Perhaps the fact that downloads doesn't correlate to citations means that they're picking up two different aspects of the research. So that citations are indicating some sort of importance to the scholarly community, and downloads are indicating some sort of importance to communities or groups outside of and beyond the academy. And so I would say probably one of the goals of altmetrics is to make that a closer correlation, to say that public impact also counts for the scholarly community, and impact on the scholarly community is to the public.
Yes. Well, thank you. I don't want to repeat myself. You can imagine that I'm not inclined to agree with your statement that scholarly is societal impact. You understand that? I'm not going to repeat my arguments. I just want to mention one other point, perhaps, that I did not mention before, if I may, and it's very short. I think you should be very careful in this debate suggesting that you can measure something like societal impact, because I believe that cannot be done in a politically neutral way. And what the danger is that by focusing or emphasizing so strongly the societal impact, you make science, even social sciences and humanities, no, I have to start again. There is the danger that you make, I'm not talking about your motives, but generally speaking, there might be a danger that you make these sciences more and more dependent upon political views and upon political objectives. And that is something that we do not want altogether, I think. It's crucial that we have science and scholarship as an independent sphere that has its own criteria of what is proper research and its own epistemological truth criteria. And we would not want the sphere of the domain of politics to be so much, dominant. So I would warn against this idea, and I can be a little bit provocative too. It is very dangerous to suggest that one can measure so easily something like societal impact. It has implications that could be negative for the development of science as a whole.
I also want to add to what Henk is saying, and I do agree with him, because I also feel that with altmetrics there is that danger of excluding or having people, despite of age, right? There could be young people out there who are not inclined to play in this social network, and they don't feel comfortable with it. They don't really particularly like it. I can, bring myself as an example. So in a sort of way, those people, older people who are not in the game, or younger people who don't want to be in the game, so I don't feel completely comfortable with the use of of these measures. And in fact, and we've seen, I've been reviewing this article lately about using age index for YouTube, and I've seen a lot of presentations from very young scholars about using bibliometrics and all sorts of methodologies on the web, and it's interesting. It is, but I really don't want to get to a point, and I don't think we all do, where scholars are going to be judged by the amount of likes they have in Facebook, and that's my fear, So, and that's my concern, I think, and I think it should be everybody's.
Well, so obviously, that's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Heather.
Let's go, Heather.
I think that's a valid fear, and I don't think it should be needed that one needs to troll for likes on Facebook, right? Then we've got a broken system in another dimension, and I think everybody agrees with that. I think I'd like to raise one set of definitions that I don't think has been highlighted, and that is that quality and impact are not the same thing, right? You can have a quality piece of scholarship that has not made a difference in the world, and which is my definition of impact, and you can have a piece of scholarship that has made a difference in the world, but many scholars wouldn't consider it to be quality. I think measuring both of them are valuable. Excelling in both of them are valuable, and we get into trouble when we use one as a proxy for another one. We do that right now in our current system, and we want to avoid doing that in the future. I think they can be hints, but they're not the same.
Yeah, so obviously the concern about the unnecessary politicization of the research system is a legitimate concern, right? So Dr. Moed, I definitely recognize your point there, and I see it as a potential danger. But what I would say to that is that, science is already a political endeavor, right? It's primarily funded by taxpayers. There's really no getting away from the political elements of it. Anyone who's been to a department meeting knows that there's all sorts of political concerns involved in operating as a researcher, right? So I think there's more danger in not recognizing and not engaging the politics than there is in trying to maintain this idea that science doesn't involve the politics. So I understand there is a necessity to maintain quality research that's not unduly influenced by political concerns, right? Because that gets into dangers of giving illegitimate authority or power to illegitimate persons or groups. But what I would say is that this demand for accountability is very much a political demand, and it's not going away. And so getting involved as researchers, I think, sort of prevents against the danger of having political influences sort of shoved down our throats, so to speak, without incorporating the views and the thoughts and the needs and interests of researchers themselves. So I guess I'm extending a sort of political call for us to speak for ourselves and to do it in an explicitly political way so that we don't sort of get steamrolled. Because it's the case that we do want to preserve the authority of our research.
Yeah, but if I may very quickly comment on that, of course, it is true that science is more and more dependent upon public funding. That's completely right, of course. But of course, that does not mean. Well, the question is, to what extent then do we want the sphere of politics to be involved in the evaluation of scientific performance? What I believe is crucial is that, first of all, the scientific community shows to the outside world, that is to the general public and to the politicians, that it has a well-functioning internal quality control system. That's first of all very important. And then secondly, I think it's extremely important that we do whatever we can to motivate our students to be influenced and to be interested in societal problems and to investigate the scientifically interesting aspects of the main main societal problems. So I do believe that a science oriented towards social problems is absolutely crucial, but I think the primary road to achieve that is by motivating researchers to be involved and to be prepared to examine the scientifically relevant aspects of those problems. And you know, that's happening already and in many ways. So many actually scientists are motivated and are interested in actually focusing on those societal problems. But perhaps we could, in our teaching especially, do even a little bit more and make certain that all students understand that it's of course a great endeavor to do science, basic science, fundamental science, but with an eye on in what possible ways it could contribute to solving particular societal issues.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I thank you for putting the emphasis on education. I think that's a very important component of all of this.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that discussion. I mean, I find the social and the political background to talking about scientific research to be a very interesting area. It has a relationship with interpersonal relationships as well, of course. For example, I was just considering the point that if Mumi writes a paper, because him and I have written together and worked together before, I am probably more likely to tweet about it and more likely to read his paper, possibly more likely to cite it as well in the future. So although we like to think of the basis on which we work to be a reasonably objective basis, the fact is that there are all sorts of relationships that are pre-existing. And from that point of view, when we take into consideration a wider social evaluation of scholarly output, we have to bear in mind and account for those kinds of relationships. And in the same way that I've heard Kelly talking about by referencing researchers with a certain status, in a sense you're paying homage to their work, and there is a currency there that goes beyond objective citation. One of the things I'm quite interested in is knowing what the meaning of behaviour in the social environment is about, whether there has been any research on what it is that somebody means when they tweet it, or what their intentions are when they bookmark a page or post it in Mendeley. To what extent can we distinguish between somebody saying this is an interesting paper, other people should look at it, or are they marketing their network and packaging up material and trying to spread their influence through being a good communicator of other people's work? I was wondering, Heather, if you had any insights into that kind of aspect of work.
I'm not sure. To be honest, okay, do you want the real honesty? I was catching up on Twitter to see whether I could respond to anybody else there. Do you want to ask me this specific question? It's good I was engaging with our audience. Sorry, my bad. Ask me the question again.
It's okay. Back channel. It's a great thing, and I was trying to get into a habit of saying people's names first before asking the question. But my question is whether there has been any if you like, qualitative research on the meaning of social activity. So, in other words, the meaning. What does it mean when you bookmark or share?
Yeah. So I think there hasn't been enough, and there hasn't been enough, and I actually am not very skilled at coming up with papers off the top of my head. So I apologize. So I don't know. I there's a Mendeley public group on altmetrics that has a lot of information that's a collecting point for research there. Encourage people to check that out and add to it, and I'll tweet some stuff when we find it. Do others have papers on the top of their heads about qualitative research about that?
I think it's also interesting because, there's all this debate about why people cite, right? So I wonder if, these metrics, like why people bookmark or why people share, it's like why people cite against, download or these things. I think it will take probably the same lines eventually of investigation into the same motivation.
So, Greg
I think one thing we can...
Oh, well, I was just going to say, so Greg Gordon and I were at a conference last October of CASRI, which is a consortium about data standards, and there was a woman there, her name is Amy LeMay, she's from the University of Toronto. She does ethnographic research about impact and sort of like the culture of research and scholarly communication. So that might be one place to start.
Yes, it would be. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We're approaching the end of our seminar. I hope that you've all enjoyed it and that the hundreds of people who have registered and been attending throughout the last few hours have got a great deal of enjoyment and engagement out of it. I would like to say thanks to Research Trends and to Elsevier Labs for supporting this venture, and a special thank you to Greg Gordon and Kelly Barr and Gudmunda Torresson in New York and Heather Pivois in Canada and William Gunn and Jeremy Frey for having taken the time out to give us some really interesting presentations. We've had a Twitter reach. I don't know if we've reached 100,000 yet, but it's a very large spread of tweets and so on. So it's very exciting. And I'd also like to say thank you to Sarah Huggett for having done most of the organising, and a special thank you to Jason Sizemore, the more or less silent person who has been producing and directing this webinar on behalf of Elsevier. So thank you very much for joining us.